According to the General Hospital recap for Thursday, August 28, Michael Corinthos turned down Drew Cain's request for shared custody, while Portia Robinson and Isaiah Gannon heated things up behind closed doors. At the Quartermaine home, Martin Gray updated Tracy Quartermaine on Drew's involvement in Stella Henry's arrest and pleaded for her assistance. Tracy agreed to assist Stella, but she stressed her activities would be distinct from Martin's. Brooklyn Quartermaine told Dante Falconeri at the police station about her contact with Giovanni Gio Palmieri at the church, and how he could use more help on his adoptive mother's birthday. Dante soon joined Gio there and made inroads by telling him a nice story about when Gio was a baby. Gio wasn't interested in being close to Dante, but he did appear to accept Dante's apologies for all that transpired when Rocco Falconeri was sick. Back at the PCPD, Alexis Davis arrived to assist Stella with her legal situation in the questioning room. Trina Robinson also told Sonny Corinthos that Drew was too accountable for Stella's trauma, so Sonny warned Alexis that Drew would get what he deserved. Jen Sidwell was furious at Windmere after Marco Rios admitted to telling Drew about the judge's bribes. Marco prophesied Drew would act on it, and Michael would turn against Sonny, causing him to lose his son. Marco believed that Natalia Ramirez had received justice. Sidwell had planned to use this power for Sonny's peers, but Marco was unconcerned about them. Nonetheless, Sidwell was enraged by Marco's error of judgment and felt they needed to focus on any negative consequences. Sidwell highlighted the significance of reaching Judge Eva Heron before Sonny did. In Portia's office at GH, she exploded at Curtis Ashford because she believed his heart had always belonged to Jordan. Curtis became enraged and revealed that he had been attempting to bury all of his animosity toward Portia so that they could be a family again, but it was plainly failing. Curtis ultimately agreed to deal with the Stella matter, but Portia believed he was unwilling to fight for them. Portia insisted that if Curtis stepped out that door, their marriage would end. Curtis did indeed walk out, so Portia shattered a framed portrait from their wedding day and began attempting to remove her ring. Meanwhile, Isaiah yelled at Jordan about her residual feelings for Curtis, believing that they'd never really had a chance as a pair because of it. Afterward, Isaiah joined Portia in her office and discovered her still fiddling with her ring. As Isaiah tried to calm Portia down, he took her hands and removed the ring. Moments later, passion exploded between Portia and Isaiah, and they made out as the clothing came off. Portia's ring ended up on the floor, near to the destroyed wedding photo frame. Drew arrived at Aurora and warned Michael that he was going to allow Willow to visit the children and apologize. Drew stated that Michael would admit to the children that he made a mistake and would agree to split custody 50-50 with Willow. Drew threatened that if Michael did not assist, he would reveal the $1 million payment made to Judge Heron the night before they appeared in court. Drew resented Sonny for the bribing and was positive that the initial custody decision would be overturned. Drew also hinted at leveraging his influence to secure a more favorable judge the next time around. Michael refused to surrender to Drew, believing that if any proof existed, it was false. Now that Drew was working this angle, Michael advised postponing the visitation hearing indefinitely. Drew called Kai Taylor as he was leaving to ask for help finding Carly Spencer. Drew returned to his own office and left Willow a hopeful voicemail. Curtis barged in and cut the connection because he had a threat to make. Curtis pledged that if Drew would not halt his crusade against his family, he would end Drew. Back with Michael, he summoned Sonny and informed him of Drew's suspicions regarding the bribed judge. Sonny insisted he was innocent, which Michael already believed. Although Sonny believed they needed to acquire answers from Judge Heron, Sidwell appeared to be preparing to get rid of her and hide his participation. General Hospital spoilers claim that viewers have had enough. Of course, everyone is discussing the Drew Quartermaine and Willow Tate plotline. Simply said, fans want it to be over already. Is the Drew and Willow story going to end soon? Even though both actors do an excellent job of bringing out the worst in their characters, the audience has had enough at this time. Some people believe Drew is killed, Willow is institutionalized, Nellie Benson returns from the grave to reclaim Wiley, and havoc erupts from there. Obviously, seeds of a Drew murder are being planted all across Port Charles, with many people believing it will be Sidwell. It goes without saying that the internet had a lot to say about the situation. Some General Hospital fans and critics even remarked, "I also believe that with so many other great storylines going on, Drew and Willow do not need to be front and center. There are a lot of other more important things going on, and I get the tone-deaf impression that the showrunners believe Drew and Willow are the A storyline." Another critic wrote, "The show has too many balls in the air. It partially explains why this occurs. And, of course, there is the reactivation of characters like as Britt, Lyle, and, soon, Nathan. What happens next for Drew and Willow? No daytime drama series is without issues. But choices must be made. They're being made. And one that has been made for months is to suggest that there would be big drama with the Drew and Willow plot. There was also this comment, "Remember how we were all so delighted when Willow dropped Drew over the Nina revelation? We were relieved to be done with those two." Of course, GH fans will have to tune in every day to see what happens next. ABC broadcasts General Hospital on weekdays. Check the local listings for times. For now, let us know what you think by leaving a comment in the section below. Michael stared at Drew with a smoldering mix of amazement and rage, his jaw clenching as he gently shook his head, refusing to move from his position. The tension between them had been building for weeks, and it had now reached a boiling point that neither of them could ignore. Drew had expected opposition when he came into the room, but he hadn't anticipated Michael's outright unwillingness to entertain the proposed joint custody plan. This was more than just parenting, it was about loyalty, trust, and unresolved past scars. Drew moved forward, trying to maintain a cool tone, but Michael detected an edge beneath his words right away. He stated that his only goal was to protect the children and provide stability, but Michael detected another motive, control. Drew had a knack of making his goals sound noble, but this time Michael was not going to be duped into complying. "You can claim it's for the kids all you want," Michael continued, his voice low but firm, "but we both know it's not just about them. You want power over their life, and I'm not giving it to you." Drew's countenance hardened, but Michael didn't stop there. He brought up everything that had transpired in the previous year, including betrayals, manipulations, and compromises that always seemed to benefit Drew more than anybody else. Every time Drew pushed the boundaries, Michael gave him the benefit of the doubt, thinking that beneath the ambition and rage, there was still a man to trust. But this is where the line was drawn. Drew's quiet spoke volumes, yet it did not imply capitulation. He finally leaned back, took a long breath, and allowed his frustration permeate through his words. He accused Michael of being selfish, letting his personal grievances override what was best for the children. He reminded Michael that no one, not even Carly or Sonny, could keep those youngsters safe from the insanity that surrounded the family forever. If they don't find a way to work together, the consequences could be far worse than any of them anticipated. Michael's jaw tightened, his fury growing, but his determination remained steadfast. He wasn't going to allow Drew's idea of family define his own. The room became heavier with each passing second, and Michael realized this wasn't just another disagreement, it was the moment when everything between them changed. The collaboration they once had, the common trust they'd attempted to rebuild, was disintegrating thread by thread. Michael's choice not to consent to shared custody was more than simply about control, it was about safeguarding his family on his own terms, not Drew's. He no longer trusted Drew's judgment, not after what had happened with Aurora, not after Drew's deliberate movements behind the scenes. Meanwhile, across town, a different kind of tension was developing between Portia and Isaiah. What began as casual encounters and lingering stares had turned into something undeniable, something none of them could conceal. Portia had tried to keep her distance, especially after what had happened with Curtis and the pressure on their marriage, but Isaiah had a way of drawing her in without even trying. Every conversation between them had an undercurrent, every glance seemed to continue a little too long, and every touch of contact made her wonder what she truly wanted. Isaiah was also forthright about his curiosity. He admired Portia's tenacity, determination, and ability to handle herself even when everything around her was coming apart. He drew her in with his quiet steadiness, which was a stark contrast to the craziness she had been surrounded by for so long. When they talked, it wasn't simply surface-level small talk. She was surprised by the depth, honesty, and shared vulnerability. One late evening at the hospital, they found themselves alone in the break room, their tension palpable. Portia attempted to concentrate on the charts in her hands, but Isaiah was studying her intently, his gaze soft but intense. He asked her if she was all right, genuinely worried, and the way he said it made her chest clench in ways she hadn't experienced in years. She brushed it off at first, stating she was all right, but Isaiah wasn't convinced. He took a step closer, lowering his voice as he assured her she didn't have to handle everything alone. For a little moment, she allowed herself to look into his eyes, and everything between them changed. The air was thick with something unspoken, hovering on the verge of crossing a line neither of them had intended to cross. Portia finally took a step back, breaking the moment before it spun out of control, but Isaiah could see it in her eyes and felt it as well. She immediately packed her belongings and exited the room, but the attraction between them persisted. If anything, it became stronger. Back at the Quartermain mansion, Michael told Willow about his altercation with Drew. He despised battling with him and the schism it was creating within the family, but he couldn't see any other path forward. Willow listened calmly, her palm resting on his, attempting to steady him despite her own growing anxieties. She understood why Michael didn't trust Drew, but she was also concerned about how this dispute might affect all of them in the long run. The family's tension was already brittle, and each fresh split widened the gap. Willow recommended having one more meeting with Drew in which emotions were set aside and the focus was only on the children, but Michael shook his head. Drew had attempted it before, and he had always twisted the circumstances to his favor. This time, Michael was not going to back down. He assured Willow that if necessary, he was willing to fight for full custody, and while the prospect terrified her, she knew better than to protest. She could tell from his gaze that he had already made up his mind. Drew, for his part, was not taking Michael's rejection lightly. He told Carly about the scenario, pacing back and forth as he rehearsed the argument in his brain. Carly tried to calm him down, telling him that pushing harder would just make Michael dig in deeper, but Drew didn't listen. He believed he had every right to be engaged in the children's life, and he was not going to let Michael keep him out. However, neither of them understood that the growing custody struggle would have far-reaching consequences. Drew became more determined, and he began to examine legal options, contacting a lawyer privately to learn more about his options. He hadn't planned to strike yet, but he wanted leverage, and Drew always found a way to acquire it. The plan, however, was perilous because if Michael uncovered Drew's intentions, the consequences would be catastrophic. While the custody fight loomed, Portia and Isaiah's relationship grew discreetly in the background. After that night in the break room, neither of them could suppress their feelings any longer. They began making reasons to spend time together, such as consulting on cases, grabbing coffee during shifts, and loitering in hallways for longer than required. The chemistry between them became stronger with each encounter, making it more difficult for Portia to tell herself that this was harmless. However, Portia was well aware that the issue was tricky. She was still attempting to salvage what she could of her marriage with Curtis, but their distance had grown, and the bitterness that remained between them made reconciliation more difficult with each passing day. Isaiah, on the other hand, appeared patient, never pressing her and always making it plain where he stood. There was something addictive about the way he looked at her, as if she wasn't invisible anymore, as if someone had finally seen her for who she was, rather than the roles she played as a wife, doctor, and mother. The tension reached a breaking point one night when Isaiah saw her alone on the hospital rooftop, staring out at the city lights. She'd been avoiding him, avoiding the truth of her feelings, but when he approached her, the barriers she'd built began to fall. He asked her if she was happy, not only with Curtis, but with herself and her life, and she couldn't say yes. For the first time, she stated that she didn't know. Isaiah took a step closer, his voice low, his presence calming her even as her heart raced. When he stretched out to brush his fingers across hers, Portia did not back away. For a little while, time stood still, and the sounds of the world receded into the background. But, just as quickly, reality returned, and she took a step back, remembering herself of what was at risk. Isaiah didn't press, but the look in his eyes told it all. This wasn't going away. Back at the mansion, Michael noticed clues that Drew was prepared to take legal action. He discovered through a mutual source that Drew had spoken with a lawyer, which further fueled his drive to fight back harder. He began assembling his own legal team, determined to defend his rights and protect his family no matter what it took. The rising battle lines between Michael and Drew paved the way for an unavoidable clash, one that would test loyalties and force everyone around them to take sides. Carly found herself divided between her allegiance to Drew and her feelings for Michael. Willow, too, was feeling the strain, knowing that whatever occurred next would forever impact their family. As summer neared in Port Charles, everything seemed to be on edge. The custody battle, the unspoken attraction simmering between Portia and Isaiah, the silent fractures growing in relationships across the city, it was all interconnected, even if no one saw the whole picture yet. Everyone kept secrets, and everyone made decisions they couldn't undo. The question was not whether everything will explode, but when. Michael and Drew were on the verge of colliding, and the consequences would be felt across Port Charles. Portia and Isaiah's relationship was also reaching a breaking point, with the potential to destroy everything she'd created with Curtis if she gave in. But, deep down, neither Michael nor Portia could deny the truth. Certain conflicts are unavoidable, some impulses are impossible to resist, and sometimes the decisions you make to protect your heart wind up crushing someone else's. And nothing in Port Charles remained buried forever, not secrets, grudges, or passion. The murmurs had grown louder in Port Charles, and anyone paying careful attention to the tangled strands of Drew and Willow's plot couldn't help but notice the sense of finality in the air. Drew Cain and Willow Tate's convoluted web of loyalty, trust, and opposing priorities had grown into something so deep that each decision they made seemed to have an impact on practically every other plot in town. However, as the days went and emotions developed, an evident shift occurred. People close to them were starting to see it as well, something in Drew's demeanor, something in Willow's hesitation when Michael's name was mentioned. It was no longer just tension, it was the weight of inevitability bearing down on both of them. Drew has been waging battles on numerous fronts since his release from jail, trying to reconstruct his life while retaining some sense of control over the turmoil around him. But somewhere along the road, his carefully crafted barricades began to erode, especially when Willow, vulnerable and overwhelmed by her continuous recuperation, relied on him in unexpected ways. Drew had initially supported her out of loyalty. She was Michael's wife, a friend, someone who had been through hell and needed stability. But Willow's quiet courage, her capacity to forgive others even when herself was breaking, gradually chipped away at the distance he worked so hard to keep. Drew was now caught in a tempest of his own creating, with his actions causing unintended repercussions. Willow had spent the last year fighting for her life. After her diagnosis and the arduous battle for her life, every moment became priceless. She had vowed to prioritize her family, to cherish the second chance she had been given, and to preserve her children's happiness above all else. But Michael's secrecy, his obsession with controlling everything and keeping her safe from uncomfortable truths, had eroded the foundation of their marriage. Drew, on the other hand, had evolved into someone she could talk to without fear of being judged, someone who actually listened without attempting to solve all of her problems. Willow found an unexpected sense of peace in him, but that same comfort also brought with it a hazardous temptation that neither of them had completely recognized until recently. It wasn't just about the attraction. It was about understanding. Drew saw Willow in ways Michael didn't, and Willow gave Drew a sense of purpose that he hadn't had since returning to Port Charles. However, as their connection deepened, so did the hazards associated with it. Nina, still determined to restore her relationship with Willow despite their tangled history, had begun to notice tiny shifts in her daughter's behavior whenever Drew's name was spoken. Brooklyn, who was passionately protective of Michael, was also concerned, gently warning him that Drew's tight relationship with Willow could not be as benign as it seemed. Even Sonny, the strategist, had begun to piece together snippets of discussions and behavioral changes that hinted something deeper was simmering beneath the surface. Michael, for his part, had a sense that something was slipping away from him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He'd been so preoccupied with his fights with Sonny, his distrust of Nina, and his relentless pursuit of control over ELQ that he'd ignored the growing distance between himself and Willow. Drew was now occupying spaces that Michael had previously filled, and the gaps were becoming increasingly visible. When Michael reflected on the commitments he and Willow had made, he felt guilty and frustrated, knowing that the person he loved the most might be finding consolation from someone else. However, Michael was not the kind to tackle such issues immediately, not yet, at least. He'd rather gather information, observe patterns, and wait for an opportunity to strike. However, everyone realized that time was running out. Drew realized that the careful equilibrium he'd sought to establish couldn't remain forever. The more he helped Willow manage her worries and dreams for the future, the more their lives became intertwined. He told himself it was harmless, that what they shared was just friendship, but late at night, when he replayed their chats in his head, the unsaid sensations told him otherwise. The guilt gnawed at him, guilt for betraying Michael's confidence, guilt for breaching boundaries he vowed he'd never do, and guilt for forcing Willow's heart to choose between two very different forms of stability. Willow, meantime, was caught up in a different kind of strife. Her feelings for Michael had not faded. She still treasured their time together, their children, and the house they had established. But her emotional attachment to Drew had become unmistakable, leaving her divided between protecting the life she'd worked so hard to restore and exploring the possibility of something she never expected. Every snatched moment, every lingering glance held the weight of uncontrollable repercussions. The thought of destroying Michael, a man who had stayed by her through some of her worst days, tormented her, as did the prospect of denying what her heart had begun to crave. The interconnectedness of everything in Port Charles exacerbated the dilemma. Drew's personal problems were growing, from his constant business disputes with Valentine over ELQ to his strained relationship with Carly, who had begun to believe that Drew's priorities were changing dangerously. Carly, as insightful as ever, had approached Drew once before, advising him not to get involved in anything that could destroy both his and Willow's lives. Drew, on the defensive and unable to reveal his true feelings, brushed her off, maintaining he knew what he was doing. Carly wasn't convinced, and if history taught Port Charles anything, it was that secrets would inevitably come out. Then there was Nina's shadow, whose calm observations became clearer by the day. Her attempts to mend wounds with Willow had mostly failed, leaving her feeling angry and desperate for a way back into her daughter's life. If Nina found even a portion of what was going on between Drew and Willow, she would not hesitate to exploit it, whether to recover leverage with Willow, build a wedge between her and Michael, or seize control in unexpected ways. Nina's quiet was not forgiveness, it was strategy, and it made her one of the most dangerous characters in this growing narrative. With so many moving parts, it became evident that the Drew and Willow storyline was approaching a tipping point. The decisions they made in the ensuing weeks would shape not only their destinies, but the lives of almost everyone around them. Drew could preserve what little trust remained between him and Michael by taking a step back to protect Willow from the impact and focusing on reconstructing his own damaged world. But if he delved deeper into his emotions, if one rash decision pushed them beyond the point of no return, there would be no turning back. Port Charles has had its fair share of betrayals, but this one would be personal and have long-term consequences for relationships. Willow saw the endgame as more about clarity than passion or betrayal. She had worked too hard to reconstruct her life to abandon it all without first comprehending her own heart. But clarity didn't come readily. The incessant pressures, her children, her recovery, Michael's implicit expectations, and Drew's quiet but consistent presence, pushed her in opposing directions until the line between right and wrong became unrecognizable. The notion of hurting Michael killed her, but the prospect of letting Drew slip away felt equally difficult. And no matter how hard she tried to repress those feelings, pretending they didn't exist just strengthened them. What none of them recognized was that others were already working behind the scenes, laying the groundwork for disclosures neither Drew nor Willow were ready to face. Jocelyn, ever interested and fiercely protective of her family, had come across snippets of conversations that did not add together. Brooklyn had disclosed her worries to Chase, who began quietly asking questions about town. Even Sonny, whose attention was divided between various problems, had begun to connect the connections in ways that showed he knew considerably more than he admitted. Port Charles survives on secrets, but it also thrives on exposure, and if the right person discovers the wrong detail, the entire facade threatens to implode. Finally, what Drew and Willow do next will determine whether or not their plot concludes soon. If they walk away now, put distance between themselves, and recommit to the life they've already built, they may be able to avoid the impending storm. But everything about their relationship indicates otherwise. Their attraction to each other is unavoidable, a magnetic pull that neither can manage to resist no matter how hard they try. And as the tension rises, as murmurs turn into confrontations and secrets begin to unravel, it becomes increasingly difficult to see a resolution in which everyone emerges undamaged. Heartbreak, betrayal, and second chances are not uncommon among Port Charles residents. However, this plot carries a new type of weight, affecting not only the persons involved, but also the entire foundation of trust between families, friends, and lovers. Whether Drew and Willow's journey concludes in tragedy, redemption, or an explosive clash with Michael, Nina, and everyone else on the sidelines, one thing is certain: the days of silent denial are over. The truth will emerge, as it always does in Port Charles, and the consequences will be far-reaching. Despite the strain simmering beneath the surface, Drew and Willow clung to the tenuous notion that they could keep their budding relationship hidden. However, the walls were closing in, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the facade. The air between them had altered in subtle ways: a lingering glance, a fleeting touch, conversations that lasted just a little too long. These were not things that could be ignored, especially in a community like Port Charles, where every secret eventually comes to light. And deep down, they both knew the clock was ticking. Drew had begun to avoid circumstances in which Michael may become suspicious, but avoidance did not equate to resolution. Every action he made seemed to have an impact on his relationships with Carly, the Quartermains, and, most importantly, Michael, who was beginning to suspect something was wrong despite his inability to put the pieces together. Willow, meanwhile, felt increasingly caught between devotion and longing. She loved her family and the life she had created, but the more she tried to suppress her feelings for Drew, the stronger they seemed to become. Port Charles has always thrived on emotional instability, and today was no exception. With Nina's suspicions growing, Carly's silent warnings hanging in the air, and Brooklyn offering Michael tiny signals about Drew's shifting priorities, it's just a matter of time before someone goes too far and the whole truth comes out. When this happens, the consequences will be unavoidable. What happens next could split families, damage friendships, and reshape loyalties throughout town. Whether the Drew and Willow tale is coming to an end or merely evolving into something larger, one thing is certain: the decisions they make now will kick off a chain of events from which Port Charles will be unable to escape.